Marcus Thompson had everything money could buy. His mansion overlooked the Hudson River, his garage housed 7 luxury cars, and his bank account had more zeros than most people could count. But money couldn't buy him the one thing he desperately wanted: respect from those who truly mattered. The 42-year-old businessman had built his empire through questionable deals and stepped on countless people along the way. His latest victim was supposed to be easy money. Staff Sergeant David Rodriguez had returned from 3 tours in Afghanistan with injuries that ended his military career. The young Marine needed work, and Marcus offered him a security job at one of his warehouses. What Marcus didn't expect was David's unwavering honesty. Within weeks of starting, David discovered that Marcus was using the warehouse to store and distribute stolen goods. The Marine's military training had taught him to recognize suspicious activity, and the constant flow of unmarked trucks arriving at odd hours raised red flags. David approached Marcus privately, hoping to resolve the situation quietly. He respected his employer and wanted to give him a chance to explain. Maybe there was something he didn't understand about the business operations. "Sir, I've noticed some irregularities in the shipping manifests," David said during a meeting in Marcus's office. "The inventory numbers don't match what's actually being moved through the warehouse." Marcus's face hardened. He had dealt with nosy employees before, but something about David's calm, respectful demeanor unnerved him. This wasn't some desperate worker he could easily intimidate or buy off. "You're new here, Rodriguez," Marcus replied, leaning back in his leather chair. "Maybe you should focus on doing your job instead of playing detective." But David couldn't let it go. His military oath had taught him about duty and honor, values that didn't disappear when he put on civilian clothes. Over the next few days, he quietly documented what he saw: serial numbers that had been filed off electronics, luxury items without proper import papers, and cash payments that weren't recorded in any official books. The breaking point came when David witnessed a truck being loaded with medical supplies that he recognized from news reports about a recent hospital robbery. Children's cancer medication worth hundreds of thousands of dollars was being packed into unmarked boxes. That night, David made copies of the shipping documents and inventory lists he had access to. He knew he had to report this to the authorities, but he also knew it would mean losing his job and possibly facing retaliation from Marcus. David's loyal companion through all of this was Max, a German shepherd he had adopted from a military dog retirement program. Max had served alongside soldiers in Afghanistan before being deemed too old for active duty. The dog understood David's moods better than most humans and sensed his master's growing stress about the warehouse situation. Every morning, Max would accompany David to the warehouse, waiting patiently in the parking lot until his shift ended. The dog had an uncanny ability to read people, and from the first day he had shown clear distrust of Marcus Thompson. When Marcus approached, Max's ears would flatten and a low growl would rumble in his throat. "That dog doesn't like me," Marcus had commented once, only half joking. "Max is a good judge of character," David had replied, not realizing how prophetic those words would prove to be. As David prepared to take his evidence to the FBI, he made one final attempt to give Marcus a chance to come clean. He requested another private meeting, this time bringing printed copies of the most damaging documents. "Mr. Thompson, I have proof of what's been happening here," David said, placing the papers on the desk. "I'm giving you 24 hours to turn yourself in before I take this to the federal authorities." Marcus's calm facade finally cracked. He stood up abruptly, knocking over his coffee cup and sending dark liquid spreading across the expensive mahogany desk. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, boy," he snarled. "I've destroyed better men than you for far less." David remained seated, his military training keeping him calm even as his heart raced. "I'm not trying to destroy you, sir. I'm trying to give you a chance to do the right thing." "The right thing?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "The right thing is keeping your mouth shut and collecting your paycheck. But since you're too stupid to understand that, we're going to have to find another solution." Marcus reached for his phone, but David stood up and walked toward the door. 24 hours? "Mr. Thompson. After that, I'm making the call." As David left the office, he didn't notice Marcus watching him through the window, already formulating a plan that would ensure the Marine never made it to the FBI. The businessman had connections in some very dark places, and he wasn't about to let a nobody with a conscience destroy everything he had built. That evening, David sat in his small apartment going over the evidence one more time. Max lay at his feet, sensing his master's tension. The dog's presence was comforting, a reminder of the brotherhood and loyalty that had kept David alive during his military service. David knew he was taking a risk by confronting Marcus directly, but his sense of honor wouldn't allow him to simply disappear with the evidence. He had been raised to believe that everyone deserved a chance at redemption, even someone as corrupt as his employer. As midnight approached, David made his decision. Tomorrow morning, he would drive to the FBI field office and turn over everything he had discovered. He would lose his job, and Marcus Thompson would probably use his influence to make sure David never worked in the security industry again. But at least he would be able to sleep at night knowing he had done the right thing. Outside his window, a black sedan pulled up across the street. Two men sat inside watching David's apartment and waiting for their orders. Marcus Thompson's 24-hour deadline had just become a death sentence, and by morning, the only witness to his crimes would be sleeping with the fishes at the bottom of the Hudson River. Max lifted his head and growled softly at the window, his instincts warning him of danger that his master couldn't yet see. The phone call came at 2 a.m. Marcus Thompson paced his study, ice clinking in his whiskey glass as he spoke in hushed tones to Vincent Caruso, a man who specialized in making problems disappear permanently. "I don't care how you do it," Marcus said, his voice cold and calculated. "Just make sure he never makes it to any federal building. And Vincent, make it look like an accident." Vincent had worked for Marcus before, handling situations that required a more direct approach than lawyers and accountants could provide. He was expensive, but he was thorough and had never left loose ends. "What about the evidence he mentioned?" Vincent asked. "Search his place after. Find everything and bring it to me. Without the Marine and without the documents, there's nothing the feds can use against me." David woke up that morning feeling strangely peaceful. He had made his decision, and for the first time in weeks he felt like he was back in control of his life. Max was already awake, sitting by the door with his leash in his mouth, ready for their morning run along the river. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Hudson as David and Max jogged along the waterfront path. It was David's favorite time of day, when the world was quiet and the water reflected the golden morning light. He had no way of knowing that Vincent and his partner were following at a distance, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. After their run, David showered and dressed in his best suit. If he was going to the FBI, he wanted to look professional and credible. He gathered all his evidence into a briefcase and took one last look around his apartment. Whatever happened after today, his life would never be the same. Max seemed unusually agitated that morning, pacing and whining in a way that was completely out of character. The dog kept positioning himself between David and the door, as if trying to prevent his master from leaving. "What's wrong, boy?" David asked, kneeling down to scratch behind Max's ears. "You've never been nervous about car rides before." But Max's military training had taught him to recognize danger, and every instinct in his body was screaming that something was wrong. The scents outside the apartment were off. Unfamiliar men had been lurking in the shadows, and the very air seemed charged with threat. David loaded Max into his pickup truck and headed toward the FBI field office in Manhattan. He had called ahead and arranged a meeting with Agent Sarah Chen, who specialized in organized crime cases. She had sounded interested when he briefly described what he had discovered at Marcus Thompson's warehouse. The drive should have taken 45 minutes, but David never made it to Manhattan. As he crossed the Riverside Drive bridge, a black sedan rammed into the side of his truck with devastating force. The impact sent David's vehicle spinning off the road and crashing through the bridge's safety barrier. Vincent had timed the attack perfectly. The bridge was relatively isolated at this hour, with minimal traffic to witness the collision. To any casual observer, it would look like a tragic accident. Perhaps the Marine had fallen, asleep at the wheel, or been driving under the influence. David's truck flipped, twice before coming to rest upside down on the muddy bank of the Hudson River. Steam rose from the crushed engine, and gasoline began to leak from the ruptured fuel tank. The briefcase containing all his evidence had been thrown clear of the vehicle and lay scattered across the riverbank, its contents mixing with mud and debris. Vincent and his partner quickly surveyed the scene from the bridge above. The truck was totaled, and there was no sign of movement from inside. But they needed to be absolutely certain that David was dead before they retrieved the evidence and disappeared. "Go down there and check," Vincent ordered his partner, a nervous man named Tony who clearly wasn't cut out for this kind of work. "Make sure he's finished." As Tony scrambled down the embankment, he discovered that the crash had been even more effective than they had hoped. David was unconscious and trapped beneath the overturned vehicle, his left leg pinned under twisted metal. Blood trickled from a head wound, and his breathing was shallow and labored. But Tony also discovered something they hadn't planned for. Max had survived the crash and was very much awake. The German Shepherd had been thrown clear of the vehicle and was now standing protectively over his unconscious master, baring his teeth and growling menacingly at anyone who approached. "There's a dog," Tony called up to Vincent. "Big one. Military-looking. Shoot it," Vincent called back without hesitation. Tony drew his pistol, but before he could fire, Max launched himself forward with lightning speed. The dog's military training kicked in as he recognized a clear threat to his handler. In Afghanistan, Max had been trained to neutralize enemies who threatened his human partners, and those instincts were still razor-sharp. The attack was swift and brutal. Max's powerful jaws clamped down on Tony's wrist, causing him to drop the gun and cry out in pain. The dog shook his head violently, the way he had been trained to disarm enemy combatants, and Tony fell backward into the muddy water. From the bridge, Vincent could hear his partner's screams echoing across the water. This was supposed to be a simple job, but everything was going wrong. He couldn't risk staying much longer. Someone would eventually hear the commotion and call the police. Vincent made a quick decision. He would leave Tony to deal with the dog and the Marine on his own. If Tony succeeded, great. If he didn't, Vincent would claim he had never seen the man before in his life. Marcus Thompson would have to find another way to clean up his mess. Meanwhile, Max had dragged the wounded Tony away from David's trapped body. The dog's protective instincts were in full overdrive now. He had lost one handler in Afghanistan when an improvised explosive device had torn through their convoy. He wasn't going to lose another. Tony tried to crawl toward his dropped pistol, but Max was having none of it. Every time the man moved, the dog would grab his clothing and pull him further away from David. Tony was bleeding heavily from the bite wounds on his arm and was growing weaker by the minute. Down by the water's edge, David began to regain consciousness. The first thing he saw was Max standing guard nearby, and the second thing he noticed was that he couldn't feel his left leg. The truck was crushing him from the waist down, and he could smell gasoline getting stronger by the minute. "Max," he called weakly, and the dog immediately came to his side. "Good boy. You're such a good boy." David tried to push against the truck, but he was too weak and the vehicle was too heavy. He could hear sirens in the distance. Someone had called for help, but he didn't think they would arrive in time. The gasoline was pooling around the truck now, and one spark would turn the whole scene into an inferno. That's when David realized that Tony wasn't just some random criminal. The man was wearing expensive clothes and had been carrying a professional-grade pistol. This hadn't been an accident at all. Someone had tried to kill him, and that someone was almost certainly Marcus Thompson. The evidence briefcase lay just a few feet away, its contents scattered but still recoverable. If David died here, Marcus would retrieve the documents and continue his criminal enterprise unopposed. All those stolen goods, all those victims who had been robbed, none of them would ever see justice. But as the sirens grew closer and Max continued to stand guard, David realized that maybe, just maybe, this story wasn't over yet. The gasoline fumes were getting stronger and David knew he was running out of time. The overturned truck creaked ominously above him, and he could feel warm liquid running down his face from the head wound. His vision kept blurring and he had to fight to stay conscious. Max paced anxiously around the wreckage, occasionally returning to lick David's face and whine softly. The dog could sense his master's growing weakness, but he didn't know how to help. In Afghanistan, when soldiers were injured, other humans would come with medical equipment and helicopters. Here, Max was alone with his dying handler and a wounded enemy who kept trying to crawl toward a weapon. The sirens David had heard were coming from a fire truck responding to reports of smoke near the bridge. Fire Captain Maria Santos was the first to arrive on the scene, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The overturned vehicle was clearly visible from the bridge, and she could see a man trapped underneath while gasoline continued to leak from the ruptured tank. "We've got a vehicle accident with entrapment," she radioed to dispatch. "Send paramedics and the heavy rescue unit. And get the police out here, there's something not right about this scene." Captain Santos had been fighting fires for 15 years, and she had developed an instinct for situations that weren't what they appeared to be. The damage pattern on the truck suggested it had been rammed by another vehicle, not that it had simply run off the road. And the injured man lying near the water looked like he had been in a fight, not a car accident. As her crew began setting up equipment to extract David from under the truck, Santos noticed the German Shepherd standing guard nearby. The dog was clearly agitated but wasn't aggressive toward the firefighters. He seemed to understand they were there to help. "Easy, boy," Santos said softly, approaching Max with her hands visible. "We're here to help your friend." Max allowed the firefighters to work around him, but he never moved more than a few feet away from David. When Tony tried to crawl toward his dropped pistol, Max immediately intercepted him, grabbing the man's ankle and dragging him back toward the water. "Captain, you need to see this," called out Lieutenant Rodriguez, one of Santos's crew members. He was standing near a scattered pile of papers that had been blown around by the wind. "These look like shipping manifests and inventory records. And there's a gun over here." Santos examined the documents while her crew worked to stabilize the truck. Even with her limited knowledge of business operations, she could tell these papers documented something illegal. The serial numbers had been blacked out on most items, and there were notes about cash payments and unmarked deliveries. "This isn't just an accident," she muttered, pulling out her radio. "Dispatch, we need police detectives out here right away. This looks like it might be connected to organized crime." Back at his mansion, Marcus Thompson was growing increasingly anxious. Vincent should have called by now to confirm that the job was done. Instead, there had been radio silence for over an hour. Marcus tried calling Vincent's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Through his study window, Marcus could see emergency vehicles heading toward the river. Their flashing lights reflected off the water, and he could hear sirens echoing across the valley. A cold dread began to settle in his stomach as he realized that something had gone very wrong with his plan. Marcus turned on the local news, hoping for information about a fatal car accident near the bridge. Instead, he saw a breaking news report about a suspicious vehicle incident that was being investigated by both fire and police units. The reporter mentioned that evidence had been recovered from the scene, but didn't elaborate on what kind of evidence. Meanwhile, down at the crash site, the heavy rescue team had arrived with hydraulic equipment capable of lifting the truck off David's trapped leg. Paramedic Jennifer Walsh was working to stabilize David's condition, while the firefighters prepared to move the vehicle. "Can you hear me?" Jennifer asked, checking David's pulse and blood pressure. "What's your name?" "David Rodriguez," he replied weakly. "Staff Sergeant, retired." "You're going to be okay, David. We're going to get you out of there." But Jennifer was more worried than she let on. David had lost a significant amount of blood, and she suspected he had internal injuries from the impact. The fact that he was still conscious was actually a good sign, but they needed to get him to a hospital quickly. Detective Ray Castellanos arrived just as the rescue team began lifting the truck. He was a 20-year veteran of the police force who specialized in cases involving organized crime. When he saw the scattered evidence and heard Captain Santos's description of the scene, he immediately recognized this as more than a simple traffic accident. "Nobody touch those documents," he ordered, pulling on latex gloves. "This whole area is now a crime scene." As the truck was slowly lifted away, David's crushed leg was revealed. The paramedics quickly stabilized the limb and prepared him for transport to the hospital. But before they loaded him into the ambulance, David grabbed Detective Castellanos' sleeve with surprising strength. "Marcus Thompson," he whispered. "He tried to kill me." "The evidence. It's all there." Detective Castellanos nodded grimly. He had heard of Marcus Thompson. The businessman had been suspected of various illegal activities for years, but nobody had ever been able to build a solid case against him. If David was telling the truth, this could be the break they had been waiting for. Max refused to leave David's side as the paramedics loaded him into the ambulance. The dog jumped into the back of the vehicle without invitation and positioned himself where he could see his master's face. "I'm sorry, but dogs aren't allowed in ambulances," one of the paramedics said. "He stays," David said firmly despite his weakened condition. "Max, he saved my life. He's not leaving me again." Jennifer Walsh looked at the German shepherd, who was sitting calmly beside the stretcher with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand exactly what was happening. He can ride up front with me, she decided, but he better be house-trained. As the ambulance pulled away from the scene, Detective Castellanos began collecting the scattered evidence. Each document he examined painted a clearer picture of Marcus Thompson's criminal enterprise. There were records of stolen electronics, forged import papers, and cash transactions that clearly violated federal laws. But the most damning piece of evidence was a small notebook that had fallen out of David's jacket pocket. In David's neat handwriting were detailed observations about the warehouse operations, including dates, times, and descriptions of suspicious activities. It was exactly the kind of meticulous documentation that prosecutors loved. Tony, the wounded gunman, was taken to a different hospital under police guard. He was conscious but refusing to answer questions about who had hired him or why he had attacked David. Detective Castellanos knew it was only a matter of time before Tony started talking. Men like him always did when they realized they were facing serious prison time. Back at his mansion, Marcus Thompson was preparing to disappear. He had a private jet fueled and ready at a small airfield outside the city, and bank accounts in several countries that didn't have extradition treaties with the United States. If Vincent and Tony had failed, it was only a matter of hours before the police came knocking on his door. But as Marcus packed his most valuable possessions, he made one crucial mistake. He decided to personally retrieve the backup files from his warehouse office, files that contained even more incriminating evidence than what David had copied. Marcus convinced himself that without those files, the authorities couldn't build a case that would hold up in court. It was a decision that would ultimately lead to his downfall, because Detective Castellanos was already on his way to the warehouse with a search warrant. The detective had learned long ago that criminals almost always made their biggest mistakes when they thought they were being clever. At the hospital, David was rushed into emergency surgery to repair the damage to his leg. Max waited patiently in the lobby, occasionally accepting gentle pets from hospital staff who were amazed by the dog's calm behavior. None of them knew that Max had spent years in war zones, where patience and vigilance were often the difference between life and death. The real drama, however, was just beginning. Detective Castellanos arrived at Marcus Thompson's warehouse just as the businessman was unlocking his office door. The detective had brought backup, 2 patrol cars and Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI, who had been expecting to meet with David Rodriguez that morning. "Mr. Thompson," Detective Castellanos called out as he approached with his weapon drawn. "Police. I need you to step away from the door and put your hands where I can see them." Marcus froze, his hand still on the door handle. His mind raced through possible explanations for why the police would be here so soon. Vincent was supposed to make David's death look like an accident. There should have been no connection back to him. "I'm sorry, officer, but I don't understand," Marcus said, trying to maintain his calm businessman facade. "Is there some kind of problem?" "David Rodriguez is alive, Mr. Thompson," Agent Chen said, stepping forward with her badge visible. "And he's told us some very interesting things about your business operations here." The color drained from Marcus's face. If David was alive, that meant Vincent had failed completely. Worse, it meant David had probably been able to tell the police exactly what had happened and who was responsible. "I want to speak to my lawyer," Marcus said, finally accepting that his carefully planned life was about to come crashing down around him. "You can call your lawyer from downtown," Detective Castellanos replied, pulling out his handcuffs. "Marcus Thompson, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, among other charges." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Marcus watched helplessly as FBI agents began photographing and cataloging the contents of his office. Everything he had worked so hard to hide was now being exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights of law enforcement scrutiny. Meanwhile, at the hospital, David was coming out of surgery. The doctors had managed to save his leg, though he would need months of physical therapy to regain full mobility. More importantly, his head injury had been less severe than initially feared, and his memory of recent events was crystal clear. Max had somehow convinced the hospital security guards to let him wait outside the operating room. The German shepherd seemed to understand that his master was in a special room where dogs weren't allowed, but he refused to leave the area. Several nurses had tried to move him to a more appropriate waiting area, but Max would simply return to his post by the operating room doors. "That dog hasn't moved in 3 hours," observed Dr. Patricia Kim, the surgeon who had repaired David's leg. "I've never seen anything like it." "Military working dogs are trained to be loyal beyond anything most people can imagine," explained Detective Castellanos, who had come to check on David's condition. "In combat zones, that kind of devotion often means the difference between life and death." When David was moved to a recovery room, Max was finally allowed to see him. The reunion was emotional. Max approached the hospital bed carefully, as if he understood that his master was fragile. He rested his head gently on David's chest and gave a soft whine that sounded almost like relief. "Good boy, Max," David whispered, his voice still weak from the anesthesia. "You saved my life, didn't you?" Agent Chen visited David's hospital room the next morning with a briefcase full of documents recovered from the crash scene and Marcus Thompson's warehouse. What she showed David exceeded even his worst suspicions about his former employer's criminal activities. "Your evidence was just the tip of the iceberg," Agent Chen explained. "Thompson was running a multi-million-dollar operation that included stolen goods, money laundering, and drug trafficking. We found connections to organized crime families in 3 different states." David studied the documents with growing amazement. He had known Marcus was involved in something illegal, but the scope of the operation was staggering. There were records of stolen art, fake pharmaceuticals, and even weapons that had been diverted from military shipments. "What about the man who attacked me?" David asked. "Tony Roselli is talking," Detective Castellanos said with satisfaction. "He's a small-time criminal who got in over his head. He's already admitted that Vincent Caruso hired him to help stage your accident. And Vincent was working directly for Thompson." "Vincent Caruso disappeared right after the failed hit," Agent Chen added. "But we'll find him. Men like that always surface eventually, and when they do, we'll be waiting." The news media picked up the story within days, and it quickly became a sensation. The combination of a corrupt businessman, an honest veteran, and a heroic military dog captured the public's imagination. Max became something of a celebrity, with reporters describing him as the 4-legged hero who helped bring down a criminal empire. David found the attention overwhelming and somewhat embarrassing. He had simply been trying to do the right thing, not become a public figure. But he understood that the story had resonated with people because it represented something important, the idea that ordinary individuals could still make a difference. When they stood up for what was right, the legal proceedings moved quickly. Tony Roselli pleaded guilty to attempted murder in exchange for his testimony against Marcus Thompson and Vincent Caruso. His detailed account of the conspiracy to kill David provided prosecutors with exactly the evidence they needed to build an airtight case. Marcus Thompson's trial began 6 months later. His expensive legal team tried to argue that he had been the victim of a rogue employee who had acted without authorization. They painted Vincent Caruso as a loose cannon who had misunderstood Marcus's instructions to handle the situation quietly. But the prosecution had too much evidence to overcome. David's meticulous documentation of the warehouse operations, combined with the financial records seized from Marcus's office, painted a clear picture of a man who had been running a sophisticated criminal enterprise for years. The most powerful moment of the trial came when David testified about the morning of the attack. He described his final conversation with Marcus, the businessman's threatening demeanor, and his decision to give Marcus 24 hours to turn himself in voluntarily. "I believed that everyone deserved a chance at redemption," David said from the witness stand. "Even someone who had done terrible things could choose to do the right thing if given the opportunity." Marcus's lawyers tried to discredit David's testimony by suggesting that his military service had made him paranoid and prone to seeing criminal conspiracies where none existed. It was a strategy that backfired spectacularly when David calmly recited his military decorations and commendations, including a Bronze Star for valor in Afghanistan. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges, including conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and money laundering. Marcus Thompson was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Vincent Caruso was eventually found hiding in Mexico and extradited back to the United States. He was sentenced to 25 years for his role in the conspiracy to murder David, and his involvement in Marcus's criminal organization. Throughout the legal proceedings, Max remained constantly at David's side. The dog seemed to understand that his master was still recovering from both physical and emotional trauma, and he rarely left David's immediate vicinity. When David had to use crutches due to his injured leg, Max would position himself on David's weak side, ready to provide support if needed. The bond between the man and dog had been forged in combat zones and strengthened by their shared survival of a murder attempt. It was a relationship that went beyond simple pet ownership. They were partners who had saved each other's lives and would continue to face whatever challenges lay ahead, together. But their story was far from over. The publicity surrounding the case had brought David to the attention of people who recognized his unique combination of military experience, moral courage, and investigative skills. Soon, he would receive an offer that would change his life in ways he never could have imagined. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, 6 months after Marcus Thompson had been sentenced. David was in his apartment doing physical therapy exercises for his injured leg when his phone rang. Max lifted his head from his favorite spot by the window, always alert to changes in their routine. "Mr. Rodriguez? This is Director James Mitchell from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. I wondered if you might have time to meet with me this week." David was surprised. The case against Marcus Thompson had been closed months ago, and he assumed his involvement with federal law enforcement was finished. He had been focused on his recovery and looking for a new job, which wasn't easy given his leg injury and the notoriety surrounding the case. Director Mitchell's office in the federal building was impressive but not intimidating. The man himself was in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of calm confidence that came from decades of experience in law enforcement. "Mr. Rodriguez, your work on the Thompson case was exceptional," Director Mitchell began. "The level of detail in your documentation and the courage you showed in pursuing the investigation despite personal risk. Those are qualities we don't see very often." David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He still wasn't used to being praised for what he considered simply doing his duty. "Sir, I just reported what I saw. Any honest person would have done the same thing." "That's where you're wrong," Director Mitchell replied with a slight smile. "We've had dozens of people work in Thompson's operations over the years. You're the only one who ever came forward." The director opened a thick file folder and spread several photographs across his desk. They showed warehouses, shipping containers, and business offices that looked similar to Marcus Thompson's operation. "What you uncovered wasn't an isolated case," Director Mitchell explained. "Thompson was part of a larger network of criminals who use legitimate businesses as fronts for illegal activities. We estimate there are hundreds of similar operations across the country, but they're extremely difficult to investigate from the outside." David studied the photographs with growing interest. His military training had taught him to recognize patterns and analyze complex situations, and he could see similarities in the way these different locations were set up. "You need someone on the inside," David said, understanding immediately where the conversation was heading. "We need someone with your specific combination of skills," Director Mitchell confirmed. "Military training, investigative instincts, and most importantly, unshakable moral courage. We're offering you a position as a special investigator with the Financial Crimes Division." David was silent for several minutes, processing the offer. It was an opportunity to make a real difference, to prevent other people from becoming victims of criminals like Marcus Thompson. But it would also mean putting himself in danger again, and he couldn't forget how close he had come to dying by the river. "What about Max?" David asked finally. Director Mitchell looked puzzled. "Your dog?" "He's not just my dog, sir. He's my partner. We've been through combat together, and he saved my life when Thompson tried to have me killed. If I take this job, Max comes with me." The director considered this unusual request. The FBI didn't typically allow agents to bring personal pets on assignments, but David Rodriguez wasn't a typical agent. His case had generated enormous positive publicity for the Bureau, and his success against Marcus Thompson had impressed everyone who reviewed the file. "We can make arrangements," Director Mitchell said after a moment. "Max would need to go through some additional training to work alongside federal agents, but given his military background, I don't think that would be a problem." David accepted the position on the spot. For the first time since his military retirement, he felt like he had found his true calling. He would be doing work that mattered, using his skills to protect innocent people from predators who hid behind respectable facades. The training program at the FBI Academy was intensive, but familiar to someone with David's military background. He learned about financial crimes, undercover operations, and federal law enforcement procedures. Max underwent training too, working with handlers who specialized in detection dogs and tactical support animals. The German Shepherd adapted quickly to his new role. His military experience had already taught him to work with teams of humans in high-stress situations, and his natural intelligence made it easy for him to learn new commands and procedures. David's first assignment came 3 months later. A trucking company in Philadelphia was suspected of being involved in a sophisticated cargo theft ring that had been operating for over 2 years. Millions of dollars worth of electronics, pharmaceuticals, and luxury goods had disappeared from shipping containers, only to resurface in black market networks across the East Coast. The company, Eastern Freight Solutions, had an excellent reputation in the industry. Its owner, Robert Chen, was a respected member of the local business community and had even received awards from the city for his contributions to economic development. On paper, everything looked legitimate, but the FBI had received tips from multiple sources suggesting that certain drivers were being paid extra money to lose specific shipments. The pattern was subtle but consistent. High value. Cargo would disappear from trucks that experienced mechanical breakdowns or routing errors in particular areas of the city. David's cover story was perfect for the situation. He was a disabled veteran looking for steady work that wouldn't require too much physical activity. His injury from the Thompson case actually helped sell the story, as he walked with a slight limp that made him appear less capable than he actually was. Robert Chen hired David almost immediately. The company was always looking for drivers who could pass thorough background checks, and David's military record and clean criminal history made him an ideal candidate. Chen even commented that it was nice to hire someone with such strong moral character. Max was introduced as David's service dog, trained to help with his physical limitations from his war injuries. This explanation satisfied everyone at the company and gave Max free access to areas where a regular pet wouldn't be allowed. Within his first week, David began noticing the same kinds of irregularities that had alerted him to Marcus Thompson's criminal activities. Certain shipments would be assigned to specific drivers, always the same group of men who seemed to have more money than their legitimate wages would support. The leader of the theft ring appeared to be Tommy Nguyen, a veteran driver who had been with the company for 8 years. Tommy drove expensive cars, wore designer clothes, and lived in a house that was far beyond what a truck driver could normally afford. Yet he maintained the image of a simple working man who was just good at managing his money. David began documenting everything he observed, just as he had done at Thompson's warehouse. He photographed shipping manifests, recorded license plate numbers of suspicious vehicles, and carefully noted which drivers were assigned to which routes. Max proved invaluable in the investigation. The dog's keen sense of smell allowed him to detect traces of drugs and other contraband that the theft ring was moving alongside the stolen merchandise. Max would alert David to suspicious cargo without drawing attention from the other workers, who simply thought the service dog was responding to his handler's needs. The breakthrough came when David volunteered to work overtime on a weekend shift. He discovered that the company's night operations were completely different from what happened during regular business hours. Trucks that were supposed to be in for maintenance were actually being loaded with unmarked cargo, and drivers he had never seen during the day were coming and going at all hours. Robert Chen himself was present during these weekend operations, personally supervising the loading of certain shipments. The respected businessman would arrive in his luxury sedan, inspect the cargo, and give specific instructions to the drivers about routes and delivery procedures. David realized that the theft ring was even more sophisticated than anyone had suspected. They weren't just stealing cargo, they were using the legitimate trucking company as a distribution network for all kinds of illegal goods. Drugs, stolen electronics, counterfeit merchandise, and even weapons were being moved through Eastern Freight Solutions under the cover of normal business operations. The most shocking discovery came when David recognized one of the late-night visitors to the warehouse. Vincent Caruso, the man who had tried to kill him on Marcus Thompson's orders, was very much alive and apparently working with Robert Chen's organization. Vincent had supposedly been serving a 25-year sentence in federal prison, but here he was, free and obviously involved in another criminal enterprise. David realized that Vincent must have made some kind of deal with federal prosecutors, possibly providing information about other criminals in exchange for early release or witness protection. David immediately contacted Director Mitchell with this information. The revelation that Vincent was active again changed the entire scope of the investigation. If Vincent was working with Chen, it meant the Philadelphia operation was connected to the same criminal network that had included Marcus Thompson. "This is bigger than we thought," Director Mitchell said during a secure phone call. "Vincent's release was part of a classified operation that I wasn't aware of. We need to proceed very..." The trap was set for the following Friday night. Director Mitchell had assembled a team of 20 federal agents to surround Eastern Freight Solutions. But they needed David to gather one final piece of evidence, proof that Robert Chen was personally involved in the illegal operations. David arrived at the warehouse that evening knowing it might be his last night under cover. Tommy Nguyen had been watching him closely all week, and David could feel the suspicion growing stronger each day. Max sensed the tension too, staying closer to David than usual and frequently checking the exits whenever they entered a building. The weekend operation began like all the others, with unmarked trucks arriving after normal business hours. But tonight was different. Vincent Caruso was present, along with several men David didn't recognize who had the look of professional criminals. They were planning something big. David positioned himself where he could overhear conversations while appearing to focus on his assigned tasks. Max lay nearby, seemingly asleep, but actually monitoring the warehouse through senses far sharper than any humans. "The Philadelphia port shipment arrives tomorrow morning," David heard Robert Chen saying to Vincent. 20 containers of electronics from overseas, all of them reported as damaged in transit. "Our documentation will show they were destroyed, but they'll actually be distributed through our normal network." Vincent nodded approvingly. "Beautiful. Clean paperwork, insurance payouts, and we move $20 million worth of merchandise through legitimate channels. Your operation here is even better than Thompson's setup." David's blood ran cold. $20 million worth of stolen goods was far beyond anything Marcus Thompson had ever attempted. This wasn't just cargo theft. It was international fraud on a massive scale. But as David strained to hear more details, he noticed that Tommy Nguyen was no longer visible in the warehouse. The veteran driver had disappeared sometime in the last few minutes, and David had a terrible feeling that Tommy was making a phone call that would expose his true identity. Max lifted his head suddenly. His ears pricked forward in the way that meant he had detected something dangerous. The dog's body language was unmistakable. Someone was approaching from behind, trying to move stealthily. David turned just in time to see Tommy Nguyen emerging from behind a stack of shipping containers, accompanied by 2 other men. All 3 were carrying weapons, and their intentions were clear from their aggressive postures. "Well, well," Tommy called out loudly enough for everyone in the warehouse to hear. "Look what we have here. David Rodriguez, the famous hero who brought down Marcus Thompson. Did you really think we wouldn't figure out who you were?" The warehouse suddenly went silent. Robert Chen and Vincent Caruso turned to stare at David, their faces showing a mixture of surprise and cold calculation. The other workers began backing away, sensing that violence was about to erupt. "FBI," David shouted, reaching for the radio device hidden in his jacket. "This is Agent Rodriguez. Execute the warrant now." But before he could complete the transmission, Tommy fired a warning shot into the air. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, and several workers dove for cover behind equipment and cargo containers. "Drop the radio, hero," Tommy ordered. "You're not calling anybody." David had no choice but to comply. He was outnumbered and outgunned, with innocent workers in the line of fire. But he wasn't defenseless. Max was already moving, using the maze of equipment and containers to approach Tommy's position without being seen. Vincent Caruso drew his own weapon and approached David with obvious relish. "You know, Rodriguez, I've been looking forward to finishing what we started by the river. Thompson may be in prison, but some of us are still free." "Vincent's supposed to be in federal custody," David said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "which means he's either an escaped prisoner or he's working for the FBI. Either way, you can't trust him." The accusation had its intended effect. Robert Chen looked at Vincent with sudden suspicion, while Tommy and his men began glancing uncertainly between their supposed allies. "He's lying," Vincent said quickly, trying to turn us against each other. But doubt had been planted, and David pressed his advantage. Check his release papers, Chen. Ask him exactly what deal he made with the feds to get out of prison early. The tension in the warehouse ratcheted higher as the criminals began to question each other's loyalties. David knew that federal agents were positioned outside, waiting for his signal or any sign that the operation had been compromised. He just needed to create enough chaos to give them an opening to move in. That's when Max made his move. The German Shepherd had circled around behind Tommy's position and now launched himself at the gunman with the same lethal precision he had shown by the river months earlier. Tommy's weapon flew from his hands as Max's powerful jaws clamped down on his wrist. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Workers screamed and ran for the exits, while the criminals scrambled to maintain control of the situation. David dove behind a forklift as bullets began flying in all directions. The sound of gunfire was the signal the federal agents had been waiting for. Within seconds, the warehouse doors burst open and FBI tactical teams poured into the building from multiple entrances. Federal agents, everyone on the ground! Robert Chen tried to run but was tackled by agents before he could reach the rear exit. Vincent Caruso surrendered immediately, dropping his weapon and raising his hands as soon as he saw the FBI tactical gear. Tommy Nguyen was in no condition to resist, as Max had him pinned to the ground with professional efficiency. The dog maintained his grip until David gave the command to release, then immediately returned to his handler's side. The entire operation was over in less than 5 minutes. 23 people were arrested, including Robert Chen and Vincent Caruso. The warehouse contained enough evidence to support dozens of federal charges, from cargo theft to international fraud to conspiracy to commit murder. Director Mitchell arrived at the scene as the prisoners were being loaded into transport vehicles. He found David sitting on a loading dock, checking Max for injuries and trying to process everything that had just happened. Outstanding work, Agent Rodriguez, Director Mitchell said. This case is going to shut down criminal operations in 6 different states. David looked up from examining Max's paws. Vincent Caruso was working for us, wasn't he? He's been an informant since his arrest in the Thompson case. Director Mitchell nodded grimly. He was part of a classified program to infiltrate organized crime networks. But somewhere along the way, he went native. Started working both sides, and now he's going back to prison for the rest of his life, along with Robert Chen and the others. This time, there won't be any deals. The trials that followed made headlines across the country. The Eastern Freight Solutions case exposed a criminal network that had been operating for over a decade, stealing hundreds of millions of dollars worth of cargo and corrupting legitimate businesses from Maine to Georgia. David's testimony was again crucial to the prosecution's case. His detailed documentation of the criminal activities, combined with the evidence seized during the FBI raid, painted a comprehensive picture of how the conspiracy had operated. But the most dramatic moment of the trial came when Max was brought into the courtroom as evidence. The judge allowed David to demonstrate how Max had been trained to detect contraband and how the dog's actions had been essential to gathering evidence and protecting David during dangerous situations. The jury was visibly moved by the partnership between the man and dog, and several jurors were seen wiping away tears as David described how Max had saved his life not once, but twice. Robert Chen was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. Vincent Caruso received life without parole for violating the terms of his cooperation agreement and attempting to murder a federal agent. Tommy Nguyen and the other conspirators received sentences ranging from 10 to 25 years. After the trials concluded, David was offered a promotion to supervise a new FBI unit focused on undercover investigations of organized crime. The unit would specialize in cases like the Thompson and Chen operations, where criminals used legitimate businesses as fronts for illegal activities. David accepted the promotion, with the understanding that Max would continue to be his partner. The German Shepherd had proven that military working dogs could be effectively retrained for civilian law enforcement, and the FBI was interested in developing similar partnerships for other agents. Their success had also inspired changes in how the FBI approached undercover operations. David's background as a disabled veteran had provided perfect cover for his investigations, and the Bureau began recruiting other veterans with similar experiences for specialized assignments. On a quiet Sunday morning, 6 months after the Eastern Freight Solutions case closed, David and Max walked along the same Hudson River path where their story had begun. David's leg had healed completely, and he no longer needed the cane he had carried during his recovery. Max ran ahead, chasing seagulls and enjoying the freedom of a peaceful morning. But every few minutes the dog would return to David's side, as if to confirm that his partner was safe and well. David reflected on how much his life had changed since that terrible morning when Marcus Thompson had tried to have him killed. He had found his calling as a federal agent,